Okay, so if Diane is such a good Nietzschean existentialist and she's so in touch with the fact that there is no being behind the doing, then what's her existentialist dilemma? How does she struggle to get a sense of purpose and to live with who she is and get a sense of identity, right? Unlike Bojack, she does not define herself by what others think of her or by her fame. Instead, she defines herself by her work, right? She really believes that there is no being except the doing. And so she's constantly looking for meaning in her own work, in what she sees as her job, her doing. And the problem is her work is very rarely actually meaningful and purpose-giving in the way that she needs it to be if she's going to define herself in terms of it. So for example, she wants her ghost-written book on Bojack to be so much more meaningful than it was actually designed to be. Right? It's supposed to be a fluffy celebrity book. He wants it to be a public image of him. She wants it to be this deeply meaningful biography. And keep your eye on this in future seasons. Notice how Diane keeps taking jobs and trying to make them more meaningful than they are. And we see her at the end of this season, and we'll take it up much more in season 2, but her wanting to run off to work for Sebastian St. Clair in war-torn regions is a dramatic attempt on her part to do meaningful work. This is a constant struggle for her. Now, the fact that she defines herself through her work is part of what makes it so poignant and painful when Bojack gives that speech to her family back in Boston about how she's a nobody and she just lives off her boyfriend and she doesn't even have a real job, right? That scene is specially designed to poke at Diane's deepest existential fears. Not only does Diane not care about fame and the public image of herself, but it's actually quite the opposite, right? It's significant that most of the jobs she takes, she's in the shadow of somebody else. When she goes off to work for Sebastian St. Clair, she's there to document him and to recede into the background. And when she's working with Bojack, she's a ghostwriter. Her name isn't even going to be on her own project. Right? She documents other people and lives in the shadow also of her famous boyfriend, who's much more of a public person than she is. She's in fact constantly avoiding attention. Track this during the show too. There are many scenes where Diane desperately doesn't want everybody's attention on her. So she's kind of the opposite of Bojack and Mr. Peanut Butter in this way. She really wants to find meaning through what she does, but she doesn't want other people to be attending to her and assessing what she does. An ongoing issue that Bojack and Diane share with each other, I think, is how much are we determined by our own past? What's the significance of our origins, our childhood, the place that we came from? How much can we get that meaning that we're looking for in our life and that sense of identity and who we are from who we used to be and where we were before? This is a recurring theme that you should also track throughout the season, but pay close attention to the scene in Boston where Bojack tells Diane that her past doesn't matter and that that's what's wonderful about Los Angeles, that nobody in Los Angeles is held down by their past. What does he mean when he says this to her? I really want you to think about this in your reflection and when you talk about this season online. What is it that he's saying about Los Angeles there when he says it's a city where origins don't matter? And is he right? And does he live by this himself, or is he trapped by his own origins and his own past in ways that he here is telling Diane he shouldn't be, but he really is? Okay, let's talk about Princess Caroline. Princess Caroline also finds meaning through work. In that sense, she's like Diane, but she does so in a different way, right? She, unlike Diane, does not need her work to be meaningful. Her work is pretty silly. She's getting silly roles for shallow celebrities. She needs to be busy. Right? She needs to be making a deal and finding an opportunity and making things happen. That's what matters to her. Her sense of self comes from having an effect on the world, making things happen. And she, in some sense, she's like the classic entrepreneur, right? She needs to be closing the deal, opening the opportunity. It kind of seems in a way like her existential purpose is to live to make other people successful, because that's sort of what an agent does. But not really, actually, if you pay close attention to her, because, for example, she enthusiastically works for Bojack, who never gets anywhere and keeps messing up all of his opportunities and keeps on undermining his own success. But she sticks by him anyway. So really making others successful looks like it's where she gets meaning from, but she's actually slightly a deeper and better person than that. But she does need to be constantly busy and constantly making things happen more than any other character on the show. I would say that her existentialist thinker, if we're going to associate Diane with Nietzsche, we're going to associate Princess Caroline with Camus, who is the other existentialist that I gave you a little snippet from. In fact, she basically quotes Camus in one of the episodes. Right? So Camus is the author of the myth of Sisyphus, and if you remember, Sisyphus is condemned to do the same pointless action over and over again, to push a boulder up a hill and watch it roll back down again for eternity. That's the god's punishment of him. But Camus argues that Sisyphus manages to find meaning even in this incredibly pointless, incredibly unpleasant task that accomplishes absolutely nothing and leaves the world exactly the same as it was before. That seems impossible, right? This seems like the most purposeless activity. How does Sisyphus manage to find meaning in it? Camus says, and you might find this plausible or not, Camus says that Sisyphus finds meaning in the work itself, not in the result of the work, but simply in the effort and busyness of doing something which is his thing, which he is exerting his will over. Right? It's the fact that he is exercising his will and working and acting and getting something done, regardless of the output of that makes him able to feel like he has a self and a purpose. And at one point, you'll remember, Princess Caroline directly cites the myth of Sisyphus. She says, "Laura, clear out the rest of my day. I have to push a boulder up a hill and then have it roll over me time and time again." So she knows that her life is a Camus life, right? So Nietzsche says that the inner source of action is a myth. It's not where we find meaning. Camus is emphasizing the other side of that I talked about at the beginning, right? That the end point or the thing that you accomplish is also not where you find meaning. And if you don't get meaning from God or nature, you don't get meaning from inner character, and you don't get meaning from what you create, then all that's left is action itself. And I think that's the big existential difference between Caroline and Diane. Right? Diane needs to feel like she's doing something meaningful in the world and creating something meaningful, changing the world in a meaningful way. She doesn't especially need to be busy. She spends a lot of time lying around. Caroline also finds meaning through work, but for her, it's just busyness itself. What about Todd? Todd's character comes out over time, but his great existential problem is that he's fundamentally distractible. He's existentially fluffy, let's say. He doesn't stick with anything or see it through. So this is like a maximally sharp contrast with Princess Caroline and Diane. He would be a terrible Sisyphus because he would roll the boulder up halfway once and then get distracted and forget to even finish. We slowly, over the course of the series, find out that he's smart and he's creative and he has something to offer, but he never stays with anything long enough to really build a full self. And he's super aware that he's kind of an incomplete, half-baked self because he can't stick with anything. And he doesn't think of himself as somebody who really has a hope of finding meaning and being substantial. He's really focused on pleasing others and doing as he's told. And his pleasures are really fleeting, because he doesn't frame himself as somebody who has any long-term goals or stable identity or really any kind of a narrative arc. Milan Kundera, who is an existentialist novelist, would say that Todd's existence is what he would call light. Right? He doesn't commit to anything, including to a real home. He's always kind of passing through and passing by. Every idea he has is something he toys with and then moves on and doesn't finish. And this is his great flaw. It also makes him a lot of fun to be around, but it means that existentially he has trouble anchoring himself. And finally, Mr. Peanut Butter. In a way, Mr. Peanut Butter is the most functional character on the show, right? He's very happy-go-lucky. Unlike all of the others, he has no trouble with self-confidence. He always seems happy with himself. One interesting reading of Mr. Peanut Butter that I really like is that all of the other characters except for him struggle with one form or another of mental illness that make their existential struggles really noticeable to them, whereas Mr. Peanut Butter is the one neurotypical character on the show. And he shows up on the show the way neurotypical people who don't have mental illness show up to those who do, who really do have existential and mental struggles. They see him as incomprehensibly unfazed by the fundamental existential difficulties of life, right? He's confident in himself and sure of who he is, even when he seems to have no grounds to be and when there's nothing underneath that, right? The rest of the characters are all sitting there struggling with mental illness and struggling with existential crises, going, there's no meaning to any of this, including for you. But Mr. Peanut Butter, somehow or other, doesn't get fazed by that. He just keeps going regardless of the void. Remember, he's the one who gave that nihilist speech about how you just fill your life with meaningless stuff until you die. So in some level, he's aware that he's that character, but he seems to be unbothered by this existential nihilism. However, he does have his own existential challenges. They're subtler, right? Mr. Peanut Butter's problem is that he's the ultimate extrovert. All of the other characters are trying to find themselves. He has the opposite problem. He projects himself onto others. He needs to be around other people all the time, and he sees himself reflected everywhere, right? Bojack is looking for himself reflected everywhere and having trouble finding it. Mr. Peanut Butter sees himself everywhere, whether it's really there or not, right? He can't see others for who they really are. And this comes up in several different ways. It's going to be important throughout the show, too. It's one of the ongoing problems between Mr. Peanut Butter and Diane in their relationship is that he sees Diane as liking what he likes, as being like him, even when she's not. And so he can't see her for herself. And this is a real problem. He's constantly making references to how he and Bojack are the same. And it drives Bojack crazy, right? He wants everybody to reflect him back to him. He even wants the character version of him to wear the same shirt as him. Track this. It's going to be his undoing in various points in the show. And one thing he doesn't have in common with Bojack is he desperately wants an audience. Always, right? He really wants an audience. But I would say they want audiences for different reasons slightly. Bojack wants an audience so that he can look at what that audience is seeing to find himself. Whereas Mr. Peanut Butter wants an audience because he sees himself reflected in that audience, and he wants that, right? He wants to be able to look outwards and see himself. So yeah, a nice example of Mr. Peanut Butter reading himself onto others, not just the fact that he tries to please Diane with things that would actually please him, and not just the fact that he needs to see Bojack in his t-shirt even to accept Bojack as playing that role, but when he hires Todd, he literally gives Todd his own CV, reads his own CV back to him as if it's Todd's, and then hires Todd. So talk about a great example of him projecting himself onto others, right? His world is a world of other Mr. Peanut Butters, and the way that he can be happy with himself is by turning that into a social project where he's socializing with himself all the time. But that makes his reading of other people very shallow, right? So other characters struggle with their existential readings of themselves. Mr. Peanut Butter is more mentally balanced than the other characters, but he struggles with his existentialist reading of others. And that's going to be a different kind of problem for him. Okay, so that's existentialism in the characters of Bojack Horseman. And I'll end this several-part lecture here, and then you can go on once you're done to the second lecture for season 1. Thanks.